3 minutes after 10 is the time, and today I think is a programme, a day even, for trying to understand things, even perhaps behaviours that you find particularly incomprehensible. There's something quite dangerous afoot. It's been afoot for quite a long time, but it is making its way, as these things do, if they're not properly challenged and called out. It's making its way from the fringes into the mainstream. And I think the best way of describing it is conflation. If, for example, okay, here's a question for you at 4 minutes after 10, just to kick things off. The wife of a prominent Labour politician, I beg your pardon, the wife of a formerly prominent Labour politician, this weekend I saw that she accused Keir Starmer of being controlled by the Israeli government. I don't know that it would be right of me to tell you who that was, because being the wife of a public figure is not necessarily something that involves having your head as far above the parapet as the public figure would do. But I mention it because it is an obviously anti-Semitic statement. To claim that Keir Starmer is controlled by the Israeli government is buying into the old trope, the one you'll remember. Jeremy Corbyn offered his support to the artist who'd done a mural of obviously Jewish puppet masters, essentially having the world dancing to their tune. The obviously anti-Semitic trope of Jewish people secretly controlling the world or the money markets or the banks or the media or whatever it may be. So that is a really blatant example of anti-Semitism. And 30p Lee Anderson opined, I think late on Friday, that Sadiq Khan was essentially controlled by Islamists. Now, Islamist is a synonym for extremist. It's an unfortunate synonym in many ways because it actually contains the word Islam. But what the conflation is designed to do is to suggest that everybody who is Muslim, whether it's Saeed Abbasi, Sajid Javid or Sadiq Khan, everybody who is Muslim must also be sympathetic to extremist ideology, to Islamist ideology. One of the bizarrest things that's happened to me in the last few years is coming to a proper understanding of how desperate some people are in this business, the media, and in politics, to undertake that conflation. They are desperate to believe it to be true. Now, the most obvious way in which you can avail yourself of the information and the experiences you need to know whether or not it is true or not is just to know a lot of Muslims. I don't want to sound trite or simplistic, but it's pretty straightforward. And if, of course, you can't do that in your personal life for, I don't know, geographic reasons or whatever it may be, you can do it by tuning into radio stations like LBC, where people born into the Muslim faith will queue up to talk to us, and a small minority of whom will sound a bit bonkers, just as with any other constituency defined relatively arbitrarily, will suffer similarly. And therefore you will come to the conclusion that the conflation of all Muslims with extremists is, for want perhaps of a different word, because Islamophobia, like Islamism, so I think Islamophobia describes people who undertake the conflation. But having a problem with Islamism, having a problem with extremism is perfectly normal. In fact, I'd say it was an identical moral and political requirement to having a problem with anti-Semitism. So if today, our time together today is going to be about understanding, I think we have to start with trying to understand the depth of feeling that is on display in this country at the moment about the situation in Gaza. I'm going to begin by telling you something that I've got a horrible feeling you might not know. I did mention it last week, but possibly not as much as I should have done. And that is, very simply, that Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that even in the event of hostage releases, he is determined to press ahead with the ground attack upon Rafah, which is essentially the only place left in Gaza to which people have been able to flee in pursuit of safety. So as the death toll is set to pass 30,000, and people with family and friends there have to suffer the regular indignity of being told that number is made up, it is not challenged by any international organisation, humanitarian or charitable, but it is a figure upon which we are compelled to rely upon a health ministry that is ultimately run by Hamas. So there is just a little, just enough room there to let people claim that the numbers aren't true. I mean, the anti-Semitic equivalent, if you like, would be to claim that the Israeli government lied about the casualties or the death tolls on October the 7th. But I think the reference to international organisations is even more pertinent. But he has made it clear that he will crack on with this ground offensive regardless of what deal is or is not signed in the meantime. Now that removes from the people minded to support almost everything Israel has done or does do, that removes from you the final platform of support that you had, the final but, the final if. Well, no, all that has to happen is Hamas have to surrender the hostages or Hamas have to sign a deal, and then it won't happen. Benjamin Netanyahu has now made a mug of you. The people who rang me and texted me, actually not so much rang me latterly, but texted me to explain it's all Hamas's fault if these 1.5 million people are to be subject to a ground offensive in the only part of Gaza where they are currently close to safe, albeit that they're living in tents and holes, having moved 5-6 times already. The people texting me say it's all on Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu has now insulted you and let you down. There were big protests on the streets in Israel over the weekend calling for Netanyahu to be dismissed. And that brings us, I think, to the question of Britain. And there are two things happening here that we have to pay attention to. The first is the conflation that I've discussed. And at its worst, it's a conflation of everybody who's Muslim with extremists and terrorists. In fact, when the former Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Nadine Dorries, retweeted somebody very bigoted and unpleasant, accusing me of being a terrorist sympathiser, the offence I was committing at the time was simply to remind people that it is disgusting to conflate all Muslims with Islamists and extremists. That became controversial in this country about 10 years ago because there is a desperation to believe, when people like Farage use phrases like fifth columnist, there's a desperation to believe that there is some sort of secret takeover underway, and even the Muslims that you are comfortable with must be pretending not to want a caliphate to be built in Britain or a jihad or whatever it may be. And people who've never been anywhere near the Bible claim to be Quranic scholars based upon something that they've read on Little Tommy Ten Names' Instagram page or whatever it may be. So that becomes part of the problem as well, this conflation. But the conflation has moved to the marches now. Because what people like Suella Braverman have done is very deliberately seek to portray everybody on those marches as an extremist. That's why she calls them hate marches. That's why she claims that Islamists are, if you like, I think she actually used the phrase, in charge of Britain. Suella Braverman has said that Islamists are in charge of Britain. She wrote an article for the Daily Telegraph in which she said that. Lee Anderson said that Islamists are in charge of London. Only one of them has been suspended by Rishi Sunak. At this point in proceedings, 12 minutes after 10 on Monday morning, I don't fully understand why. The truth is, she wrote, that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. I think because she didn't mention anybody by name, she's managed to get off the hook. Either that or there are some fairly epic double standards in play here. But of course, Lee Anderson did mention someone by name. He mentioned Sadiq Khan. And when Zach Goldsmith was trying to become Mayor of London, he also accused Sadiq Khan, or he also sought to conflate Sadiq Khan with extremists and or terrorists. But he did it by name, and he didn't get suspended. He got put in the House of Lords. There's two questions there. Why has Lee Anderson been treated differently from Suella Braverman, and why was Lee Anderson treated differently from Zach Goldsmith? Second question you could perhaps answer by reminding yourself that Boris Johnson was in charge when Zach Goldsmith got put in the House of Lords. So that now the march is a howl of frustration. The marches, plural, are howls of frustration Even this non-story about Coca-Cola being on sale in a chicken shop in Bradford is about a howl of frustration in some ways that is a consequence, I think, of my profession's failure to do its job better. Because what we're seeing at the moment is people who aren't relying on traditional media for their news, people who are taking footage from social media, people who are watching Al Jazeera, which is owned either entirely or in large part by the government in Qatar, which is, of course, where some Hezbollah leaders are hiding out. So these things are never simple or straightforward. But I guess the best way to test how well served you are being by British media is asking you to put your hand up if you knew last week that Netanyahu had said he was going to go into Rafah even if a hostage settlement was reached. Because if you didn't, you've been let down by the media. If you didn't, you've been misled by politics, by politicians. And that is why the levels of frustration that are now on display are reaching levels that, without a proper understanding of the context, could be quite alarming. So how do we do it today? I think we'll start by looking at the people who go on the march, all right? Because what you have now is senior Tory politicians like Suella Braverman and 30p Lee essentially seeking to portray everybody who has gone on a march in support of the people in Gaza and in pursuit of a ceasefire because they want civilians to stop being killed. People like Suella Braverman and 30p Lee are seeking to portray those people as extremists. Now, I haven't been on any marches during this window of time, but I've seen a lot of people that have. I normally see them getting off the tube at the other end, at the end of their day's work. And I would struggle to make a demographic generalization, but middle-aged, middle-class white women, and of course white women can be Muslims too, seem to me to be the ones I'm most likely to see hopping off the tube. It was in Twickenham last Saturday where I was attending something with my children, holding their Free Palestine banners. The idea that they are Islamist extremists, they looked in part, there was a group of 3 of them I'm thinking of specifically, like primary school teachers. The idea that they are hate marchers or Islamist extremists or anything of the sort is beyond obnoxious. It's beyond obnoxious. It's deeply, deeply dangerous. Now, I personally think, from my relatively cursory study of his output, that 30p Lee is too stupid to understand what he was dealing with last week. I don't think he's the brightest bear in the woods. I stress again, he has similar intellectual capacity to Jacob Rees-Mogg, so please don't think I'm being snobbish. I think they're both as thick as mints, but one of them spent 50 grand a year. One of their dads had 50 grand a year to spend on an education. And in our class-obsessed country, it creates the illusion that because somebody knows a few words of Latin, they are intelligent as opposed to simply educated. But Anderson is neither. He's neither intelligent nor educated. So he probably believes on some level that Sadiq Khan is a terrorist sympathizer because he lacks the critical thinking to arrive at the obviously opposite conclusion. And when he sees the pictures of the marches, he somehow manages not to see middle-aged, middle-class white women holding up Free Palestine banners. All he sees is Johnny Jihad. And that is a failure of imagination as well as a failure of integrity. 17 minutes after 10 is the time. So what I think we'll start with today is 2 things, right? I want you, if you consider yourself to be about as far from the notion of an Islamist extremist as it's possible to be, but you have marched in support of the Palestinian people over the last few months, I want you to ring me, tell me a bit about yourself, and then tell me why you're marching. So I think there's probably Ofcom rules about me saying something like, don't give me a ring if you're a Muslim, but I'm looking for even a moderate Muslim is more susceptible to the conflation that people like Suella Braverman, and of course the massive majority of Muslims and moderates, just as the massive majority of Christians are. But I'm looking for a successful refutation. I'm working on the probably naive principle that someone like 30p Lee, if he were to actually meet people who go on these marches would realise that he has been horribly misled by people like Suella Braverman. He has been misled into thinking that they're all extremists, they're all Islamists, they're all Johnny Jihads, whereas in fact they are much more likely to be people like you. Okay? So, you go on these marches, whether you've been on one or whether you've been on half a dozen. You turn on your radio some mornings and you hear yourself being described as akin to Osama bin Laden, and you think, well, hang on a minute, I'm a pensioner from Worthing. I've never been involved in any extremism in my life. But members of the right-wing media are either too corrupt or too stupid to realise the truth. Members of the right wing of the Conservative Party are deliberately trying to conflate decent humanitarian civilians with extremists. And the consequence of them doing that is people like 30p Lee saying what they said on Friday about the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. So let's just find out what sort of person goes on a march in support of the Palestinian people, in pursuit of a ceasefire. And the more you think you challenge Braverman and Anderson's notion that you must be an extremist, that you are a hate marcher, that you are a supporter of Hamas, that you are anti-Semitic. That's what she said. The truth is that the Islamists, the extremists, and the anti-Semites are in charge now. It's a profoundly Islamophobic statement, because what she's saying is, you see all those people marching in support of Palestine, or you see all those people over there who look a bit Muslim, they're all extremists. They're all anti-Semites. They're all Islamists. Which is very similar to saying that Keir Starmer is controlled by the Israeli government, which the wife of a formerly prominent former member of the Labour Party, very senior member of the Labour Party, tweeted this very weekend. So there it is, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Who are you? And why did you go on that march? I'm just going to deal with something quickly to save people like Karen in Barnet texting me again. Could you also ask your callers whether they marched for the hundreds of thousands of people killed by Assad, for example, and if not, why not? Again, I see this a lot, Karen. You're precisely the sort of person who was texting me last week to say that all that needs to happen for Rafah not to be attacked is for Hamas to sign a hostage deal. Netanyahu has now insulted and let you down because he said he's going to attack anyway. The answer with regard to Assad, very simply, is that it's not the British government's policy to support Assad. So you don't need to take to the streets to call upon your own government to do something if they're already doing it. You don't need to take to the streets of London. You could perhaps take to the streets of London and ask for a military intervention in Syria to stop Assad, but that would involve you somehow thinking that Benjamin Netanyahu and Assad's murderous regime, which seeks to kill civilians all the time, are similar. Now, I'm not going to say that they're similar because that's your opinion, but I can answer your question as to why you'd march against one and not against the other, and the answer could not be simpler. I think I can probably even say it in a single sentence. The British government was not supportive of Assad's ethnic cleansing. So British people don't feel any need to march against it. I hope you wrote that down. It's 10:22. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Anybody who fails to understand the gravity of 30p Lee Anderson's comments about Sadiq Khan at the end of last week is either blind to or missing the deliberate attempts to conflate all Muslims with extremists and or Islamists. I don't understand why he gets punished but Suella Braverman doesn't, because she has said, she has written, the truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. It's a variety of something called the Great Replacement Theory, which is when the people in power try to persuade the people with no power to keep them in power by claiming that an unspecified alien immigrant threat is poised to take over. And that's how you end up putting people like Donald Trump in the White House or Suella Braverman in the Home Office. So let's get a more nuanced picture, shall we, of what people on these marches look like, sound like, and believe. Bob's in Brighton. Bob, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
I've been on a couple of these marches. I've been on marches in the past as well. I am white, middle class, cis male, living in the home counties, comprehensive education, wife, 2 kids, dog, not an extremist.
How old are you?
42.
42. I mean, not an anti-Semite, not an extremist, not an Islamist. Are you in a minority when you find yourself on these marches? Are you surrounded by people screaming for the abolition of the State of Israel?
No. I think with any protest, you always get an extreme element,
of course,
but they are by far the minority. I find myself walking alongside a really broad range of people, all ages, families, backgrounds. I'm not religious myself. I'm an atheist, but you find yourself walking alongside Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs. There's different trade union groups that show solidarity. I've seen vicars. I've seen, there's such a broad range of people. You're not limited by demographic.
So, I mean, there's obviously an element of mischief involved in my motivations this morning, because I know the answer to the question that I'm asking, and I'm pretty sure that Suella Braverman does too. I'm not so sure about 30p Lee, actually. I think he might be more a victim of the bigotry than a proponent of it, but I'm sure that will annoy some people for a variety of reasons. How do you then feel when you are portrayed by a former Home Secretary as being a hate marcher?
I feel like they're devaluing a legitimate view. I feel like I'm being othered, being made into an extremist for having quite legitimate concerns. I feel like I haven't got a voice. It's very unusual for there to be just such a prolonged period of protest in this country over such a single issue that is getting such huge numbers. Those people are just being marginalised, and it's not being done on accident. It's being done on purpose. It's being done to further a political agenda and a political narrative.
And I don't know that there is a challenge to that position, because it seems to me like a statement of fact. But of course, if you're a Suella Braverman sympathiser, then you are welcome to explain to Bob, and indeed to me, why her typification, her characterisation of people who go on these marches is accurate, and the explanations of the people who go on these marches should be ignored. Robin's in Clapham. Robin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome.
I've listened to you recently, actually, and I have to say I share most of your opinion on this thing. I have been on a march. I'm an ex-army officer. I retired some time ago. I served in Ireland, in Iraq. And I'm horrified, really, at the stance that our government is taking in its support of basically what Israel is doing in Gaza. By virtue of the fact that they're using, for example, non-precision guided weapons and just dropping bombs on clearly, innocent women and children, it horrifies me. It really does, because it's something that we in the British Army would not do. And when I hear people talk about Dresden and things like that, it's quite irrelevant. We've moved on.
Well, the Geneva Convention, I think, was framed partly from the ashes of Dresden, wasn't it?
Because of Dresden.
Yes.
Yeah, I've just been watching Masters of the Air, actually, which is great. And, I know it's but actually,
it's a bit of a busman's holiday.
But you've got guys whose consciences are pricked.
Oh, you're quite right.
That they've got to drop bombs, close to the cathedral when it's coming out on a Sunday.
Churchill distanced himself a bit from Bomber Harris, didn't he?
Well, I mean, Bomber Command was completely ostracised, after the war for quite some time, and it wasn't their fault. The guys doing it, again, I'm not saying whether or not there's any fact between Israeli pilots, deliberately dropping precision-guided bombs. But we do know that half of the munitions that have been used in Gaza are not precision-guided. I mean, why would you want to drop a 2,000 bomb on several buildings and flatten the whole thing, thinking that, Hamas are in tunnels anyway? I mean, what's the point? Look, I think we could go on for hours about, what is right and what is wrong.
We've got to go to the news, but briefly, a quick word, if you would. Yes, Suella Braverman calling you a former army officer a hate marcher.
She's a vile person, who's doing this really for her own political agenda. And it's the sort of Donald Trump dog whistle, let's tell everybody that, I'm an extremist, blah, 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 to further her own career. And that people who do that are morally bankrupt, quite frankly. They really are. I believe that as a soldier, as an ex-soldier, we had a real sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's morally correct. And I see people like Suella Braverman, not 30p Lee, because I just think he's misinformed, and he spent too much time on GB News with people like Nigel Farage. But people like Suella Braverman really should know better. I mean, she's a disgrace, quite frankly.
Well, I think the only thing we disagree on, and I suspect we probably wouldn't if we carried on talking for a little longer, is that she does. I think she probably does know better, Robin, and that's I think your point in a nutshell. A couple of phone lines free. Don't text me to complain that you can't get through. Wait until someone like Robin says goodbye, and then dial 0345 60 60 973. It's 10:32. Holly Harris has the headlines. It is 10:36. I'm supremely unsurprised by the fact that my last caller was a former military officer. I'm just wondering about people who will be surprised. This plays into that idea as well. This text that has come in, just looking at not so much the reasons why, but the reality or otherwise of claims by people like Suella Braverman that people marching for peace in the Middle East are extremists or Islamists or anti-Semites or hate marchers. Dave's been in touch. He says, I took a Telegraph reading friend to the march last week. Telegraph plays an interesting role in this process, actually, because I think, and we'll talk about this a little more in a moment, I think what Suella Braverman wrote in the Telegraph was worse than what 30p Lee said on GBB's. I'll tell you why shortly. But Dave says, I took a Telegraph reading friend to the march last week after a discussion where he told me Muslims were rioting in London each weekend and Jews were afraid to walk the streets. He's a reasonably intelligent and well-educated man working as a manager in the city. He was totally amazed at the demographics of the protesters and was even more blown away when he saw a group of Orthodox Jews as part of the demo. I think that is a lot closer to reality than anything that Suella Braverman reflects. And I don't know why. I'm not alone in suggesting that she knows exactly what she's doing, whereas 30p Lee may just be too daft to realise. I don't know whether that's fair or not. It's certainly fair on her, but possibly we're giving him the benefit of the doubt when, frankly, he deserves none. Naomi's in Plymouth. Naomi, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning, James.
Hello.
So yes, I go to the marches most weeks as much as I can.
Are you an Islamist, an extremist, an anti-Semite, or just a normal hate marcher, Naomi?
I'm just a regular person.
Oh.
Sorry to upset you there.
Yes.
But no, people that go to those marches. I'm a nurse. I'm a registered nurse. There's professors. There's doctors. You've got the Jewish bloc, the Orthodox Jews, as you just mentioned, that are there every single week. I mean, why are the news not portraying and actually showing all these other groups of people that actually attend these marches? So for me, this hate that they are spewing is like the hate against Jeremy Corbyn. They wanted to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn because actually Jeremy Corbyn would
let's not get distracted.
Be allowing the government.
You can hang on. I mean, this is a bit of a hijack of the show because the defence.
It's not a hijack of the show.
Well, hang on. How do you know what was? Tell me what was I about to say? What was I about to say? Hang on. What was I about to say? No, we're off. What was I about to say that you knew was wrong?
What were you about to say?
No, you tell me because you knew it was wrong.
No, it wasn't. I didn't hijack your show.
No, I just told you that this was a bit of a distraction and you said it wasn't, so you must have known what I was going to say.
It wasn't. All
right, take a guess. You remember earlier I said the wife of a former prominent Labour politician had accused Keir Starmer of being controlled by the Israeli government this weekend. Guess who it was?
Who was that?
Take a guess.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, you do. You can't get his name out of your mouth.
I've actually missed that bit of news.
Go on. Well, take a wild guess then.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Take a wild guess. Well, it's a definition of anti-Semitism to claim that a Western politician is controlled by the Israeli government.
We've totally gone off the subject.
Well, you just said we hadn't.
There's doctors. There's
you just said we hadn't.
Hospitals.
Yes.
At these marches.
Well, I know that.
I just said the Jewish bloc are there. Why does the news not portray this? Why is the news not even actually really filming our marches?
Well, it's trying to, but I agree with you. It's not there. Just to be absolutely clear on the Jeremy Corbyn point, none of the people you were marching with, as far as you're aware, ever wrote the foreword for a profoundly anti-Semitic book, did they?
No,
because he did. James is in Leatherhead. James, what would you like to say?
Good morning. I'd just like to say that obviously the media in this country, I think, do, as one of your previous callers says, like to broadcast their political agenda. I mean, I've been on quite a few of these marches myself, and I think that they're peaceful every time. They're the most diverse and peaceful protests I've seen. I always stood next to middle-aged white women. I always stood next to even Jews with placards saying, I am a Jew and I condone Israel. So for them to say that everyone in the marches is, condemn Israel, for the media and Suella Braverman to say they're hate marches, I think is just wrong, and it's just broadcasting the political agenda against Muslims in a way.
Well, the conflation is, isn't it? I don't think that's even controversial. That's why he's had to go. Accusing Sadiq Khan of being controlled by Islamists is the same as accusing Keir Starmer of being controlled by the Israeli government. One is anti-Semitic, one is anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia. But while you're here, I don't think I've got an answer to this question, James. So we know what Anderson said. But this is what Braverman said last week. The truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. They've bullied the Labour Party, they have bullied our institutions, and now they have bullied our country into submission. Which is worse, to accuse London of being controlled by Islamists, or to claim that London is, or to claim that the whole country is?
Yeah, well, I think it's an absurd claim anyway, because I don't think that's remotely true.
Well, I do too, but I'm just intrigued by why she's still got the whip and he hasn't.
Yeah, well, questions do have to be asked, unfortunately, and hopefully one day we'll get answers.
Hopefully someone will ask them one day. I mean, the hearing, was it Oliver Dowden yesterday, claiming that Suella Braverman hadn't crossed the line. I did find myself wondering where the line is. Saying that London is controlled by Islamists crosses the line. Saying that Britain has been bullied into submission by Islamists, extremists and anti-Semites doesn't cross the line. You have to wonder where the line is. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need to tell me whether or not you recognise the characterisation of yourself as someone who goes on these marches. And that is, of course, a characterisation picked up by Suella Braverman and latterly by 30p Lee Anderson. It's 10:42, so we can probably squeeze in a couple of calls on who's worse. What's the difference? I get Anderson's words exactly right, and then I'll set them alongside Suella Braverman's, and you can tell me which ones you think are worse. So he has, 30p Lee essentially said that Islamists had got control of, those are quotes, Sadiq Khan, and he said that the London mayor had given our capital city away to his mates. Those are quotes as well. Suella Braverman wrote, the truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. They have bullied the Labour Party. They have bullied our institutions. Remember, Jeremy Corbyn, who the last caller referred to, is no longer a member of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer has thrown him out. So Keir Starmer has been so successfully bullied by anti-Semites that he's thrown Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party. It doesn't even stand up to the scantest scrutiny. And now they have bullied our country into submission. If, like me, you think Braverman's words are worse, do you want to have a crack at explaining why it's 30p that got suspended and not her? Michelle's in Lancaster. Michelle, what would you like to say?
Well, I suppose to say, Curtis, is good morning. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I'm in Lancaster, nice sleepy county town in the north.
I'm not that immersed in London-centric politics. I know where Lancaster is, Michelle, but thanks for the geography lesson.
Your lovely lady said, "Where's that?"
Oh,
and I said, "Lancashire."
What can I say? All right, carry on.
Bacon butties up here,
Yeah, I bet you've even. You'll be getting latte coffees next, won't you? I tell you, the world's going to hell in a handcart. The fellow who runs that Farage party thinks that the working class, I'm not suggesting for a minute that I know what socio-economic class you belong to, that lattes are somehow the work of the enemy. But anyway, we digress. Who goes on these marches? What sort of person goes on these marches?
Well, average, overweight, middle-aged women like me who don't want to see people killed.
Makes you an extremist, apparently, according to Suella Braverman, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes you a mum. Just grow up, pack in the fighting, because you got to pack in the fighting at some point. Otherwise, are you saying we're going to carry on fighting forever and ever and ever? No, it's got to stop. It's like, we lived through Northern Ireland, didn't we? We lived through that. That was never going to stop. And we've learned, 25 years has told us, peace is cheap and it pays dividends. I work in a supermarket. I'm a supermarket checkout girl. Yes, I'm doing a working class job. I'm from the working class, but, I'm tertiary educated. That's what happens.
Yes. Yes.
There's loads of us who were tertiary educated, ex-teachers and whatever on the checkout.
Why is that? Just out of interest.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Because we're poor.
No, but I
and
mean,
we're
why did you leave teaching to do something different?
Well, I was never never a teacher. Other ladies, they're retired teachers, and they do a few hours
Oh,
on
I
check
see.
out.
Okay, yes, no, I understand.
You know, and it's the same. It's the same thing. You know, just behave. Just stop the fighting. Come to the table. Talk.
And
Israel
listen,
should be talking.
Someone can accuse you of naivety for that position. They're perfectly entitled to. But to accuse you of being an extremist, an anti-Semite or an Islamist is libelous, actually. And that of course, is possibly what Braverman's defence would be, is that she hasn't actually maligned any individuals. She's just maligned everybody. Everybody, really, full stop. And Veronica in Norwich tells me that on a different radio show, different radio station, someone did actually ask Mark Harper what the difference was between Anderson and Braverman's comments, and he said that Braverman's weren't directed at an individual, which was the only thing I could see speculatively earlier as getting her off the hook that Anderson has been hung upon. But then we're reminded, of course, that Zach Goldsmith did absolutely seek a similar conflation with the same politician, Sadiq Khan, and Boris Johnson saw fit to put him in the House of Lords. 10:46 is the time now. 10 to 11 is the time. Violent clashes with police, dozens of arrests, missiles and a metal crowd control barrier thrown at police as officers tried to control crowds. One man arrested on suspicion of possessing a weapon. Hundreds of hooligans chanting and clashing with around 50 Met officers wearing riot helmets, protective gloves and yellow jackets. A crowd of men surging forward on two occasions, trying to break through the police line. They were held back, but as they pushed together, they threw beer cans and vapes while waving red smoke. You thought we were still talking about the Palestinian peace marches that Suella Braverman has described as hate marches. We are, of course, talking about that time the far right turned up at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Day. Some would argue as a consequence of her invitation, and she subsequently turned on the police despite still being Home Secretary. It's hard to pick the key players in these abominations, these unfolding abominations, but Braverman's the worst, I think arguably by some distance. 30p Lee has the defence of daftness. And look, Braverman's no genius, but she's the worst. She attacked the police. She has spent much of her time since being sacked from government for the second time, complaining about the immigration policies of governments in which she had overall responsibility for immigration in 21 of the 23 months preceding her second sacking. So her words are, I think, worse. Because she didn't personally name Sadiq Khan or any other individual, the defence apparently is that her words are therefore not as bad as 30p Lee's. It's very odd business. 10:52 is the time. Jerry's in Bushy. Jerry, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Yes, I'm a Roman Catholic, and I've been on the last two London marches. I marched with a group called Christians for Palestine.
Okay.
We meet beforehand to pray for peace. We march demanding peace. There's absolutely no hatred. There's just love for everyone, and a desire to see an end to what's going on in Gaza. And I really resent being told that I'm a hate marcher.
It is the phrase you use. You are a hate marcher. They are hate marches. I suppose, I mean, we have to raise the possibility that everyone who's called the show today are a tiny minority in an otherwise enormous sea of Islamists, extremists and anti-Semites. But you'd have thought you'd have seen them.
Well, indeed. I mean, we've marched alongside a number of groups, some obviously some Muslim groups, but, they haven't been chanting hate chants or anything. LGBT plus groups as well. There's a huge cross-section of the community there, and I have not encountered any hatred at all. The marches are so vast that there may be one or two idiots.
Well, there are. We know that arrests. We know that arrests have been made. There were the two women with hang gliders on her back, on their backs. We know, and of course, the from the river to the sea placards remain controversial, particularly when carried by people marching in support of Palestinian people. I think they're fine if they appear on Likud party election leaflets, but hey ho, that's a conversation for another day. Hand on heart, Jerry, because I don't want to sort of put words into your mouth or create a sort of a fake context. Hand on heart, is it really hurtful when can you really say that in honesty that Suella Braverman is being hurtful towards you personally when she calls them hate marches?
Well, I think she's having a go at everyone. She's trying to stir up trouble against everyone who's marching. And in fact, I've got a good friend whose politics are the total opposite of mine. He's on the far right.
Yes.
And I posted a picture of myself on the first march. And his response was to call it a hate march, and I did respond to him, hopefully with love, pointing out that was far from the case.
I think you've answered my next question there with your comment about love when I said how can you stay friends with someone like that? But of course, you don't believe that anybody's immortal soul is lost forever, Jerry. I received a similar schooling myself. Take care. 10:55 is the time. Adriana is in Wimbledon. Adriana, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Thank you for eventually I got through.
Well done.
But,
patience is a virtue, Adriana.
Yeah, I've been trying for years. I am ringing because I've been on some vigils, some local protests. I haven't actually been on any marches, but it has been attended by so many different types of people of different backgrounds, and they are organised. Apart from Stop the War, who organised quite a few, there are other people getting involved who are just trying to appeal to humanity. And going back quite a few months now, in early December, I went to Humanity Not Hatred. I think it is the organisation that organised march. That was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury, rabbi, leader.
Yes, I think I remember the reports of it. Yes,
and all with the common aim to find a solution. I think the problem is that there's certain narratives that are so extreme, people won't look at a common thread. And for me, the common thread is people are dying in their tens of thousands, or starving, or being maimed. And
however idealistic it may be, and I don't think it is, for the record, to call for that to stop should not really see you attacked, libelled and maligned by a former Home Secretary of this country and still a fully paid up member of the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
Yes, that's right, and it appeals to certain people, but I don't blame people for. I talk to people. They say, "Oh, I can't bear to watch the news. I can't bear to watch." But I do watch Al Jazeera, and I know it's supported by the Qataris, it's funded, and you would get a bias there. But I use
the BBC is well, it's not funded by the British government, is it? But I don't know. I've been critical of Al Jazeera a bit in the past, and I probably haven't watched it enough to justify that. But know that they've got cameras in places that some of our news organisations haven't managed to get them.
They have, and they've got reporters on the ground, and basically, many years ago in the 80s, I worked for 4 years for Amnesty International, and it was during the Marcos era.
Oh, gosh.
And I was working on Indonesia and Philippines. What I learned there, I don't know that Amnesty operates that way anymore. You have to take information from all sorts of news channels and reports and find the common thread.
That's a very good point. And of course that's rendered rather difficult in these circumstances by the control that Israel exercises over which Western news organisations can get into Gaza on anything like the scale that they would have got into other trouble spots from the former Yugoslavia right through to more recent conflicts. Thank you, Adriana. And I need to tell you that a 25-year-old US airman who has set himself on fire just takes us back slightly to Robin's call, doesn't it, as a former army officer. has set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy. A lot of you are drawing this to my attention, and he died yelling, "Free Palestine." I wonder whether Suella Braverman considers him an extremist, an Islamist, an anti-Semite, or possibly all three. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. There's some I don't know, confusion, I think, over whether or not Aaron Bushnell, the active duty member of the US Air Force who set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and while shouted "Free Palestine" repeatedly, there's some confusion over whether or not he is still alive or not, and I'll keep you up to date. But I don't know, I just found that quite poignant, actually, because I think when Robin rang in the last hour and said, as a former army officer, that the point of that hour of conversation was just to have a little look at the accuracy of people like Suella Braverman when they call these marches hate marches, or when they claim that the country has been bullied into submission by Islamists. I mean, if she has any friends, they should be staging some sort of intervention. I've got no reason to believe she doesn't have any friends. But the alternative is just to conclude that they agree with her, that they're all signed up to this profoundly, I think, ridiculous worldview. But the fact that an army officer was... So what is this 25-year-old American airman? What's he? Is he an Islamist, an extremist, or an... It's just such a stupid... If you want to understand things... The first problem you've got is people who don't want you to understand things. They just want you to feel the hate. Suella Braverman, feel the hate. She hates the police. The police are biased. The country's biased. Everybody's been... It's incredible. I don't know what my favourite Suella Braverman anecdote is. Probably the time she claimed that she'd helped write a law textbook. Did you see that story? It was on her CV, actually. I think it was on her CV at Chambers, certainly. I don't know whether it was on her CV as a politician, but the bloke who actually wrote it gave an interview to The Big Issue a couple of years later in which he said that he thinks she might possibly have done a bit of photocopying for him once. But in Suella Braverman's warped universe, that makes her practically a co-author of a legal textbook. The actual author, I think she might have done a little bit of photocopying for me once, but I can't be sure. In Suella Braverman's mind, I helped write a book. I helped write a textbook. It's extraordinary. But that's the kind of person that flourishes at the moment in Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. There is, as I often tell you, there's so little pleasure in seeing your predictions come true. But it wasn't that long ago that I told you, if you had mental health problems, be afraid. Be very afraid, because they will be coming for you very soon. And the reason why I said that was because of a life spent studying toxic right-wing journalists and journalism, and the failure that this current party has, its inability really to demonise immigration, because they can't claim it's not their fault. That's why Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson are going after Muslims, British people, British Muslims, born here, like Sadiq Khan. Because they can't really use immigrants in general anymore as the alien to be othered. Because if you are somebody who has a problem with another human being dependent entirely upon where they were born, for example, if you really don't like Boris Johnson and don't think he's properly British because he was born in America, and I think one of his great-grandfathers grandfathers was Turkish. So if you're that kind of racist, they can't come for you anymore, because you just turn around and say, even you've got the brains to say, hang on a minute, you've been in power for 14 years and immigration's higher than it's ever been. How can you be on our side? You're clearly not. So they think, Christ, we've blown the immigration thing completely. How are we going to... we can't do... It's usually anti-Semitism that would step into this sort of space historically, as any Jewish person will tell you. Anti-Semitism is never far from the surface, particularly in times of economic difficulty or political expediency. But we can't do that because we made such a fuss about what happened in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, so anti-Semitism's off limits. Oh, let's just go for the Muslims again. Let's just go for the Muslims again. And that is, of course, what they've done. But it's not a big enough target, really, however hard they try, for the 2-minute hate that the right wing needs to offer up every morning. You know, the bigger the topic, the bigger the the bigger the hate, which is why I knew it would be disability and mental health, or physical and mental disabilities that would come around next. The first thing that you'll get is the work shy, the idea that people who can't work are choosing to be in that situation. I mean, the best way of explaining that is to actually conflate mental health with physical health. And some of the stuff that you will read and hear from right-wing commentators is akin to telling someone with a broken leg that they just need a more positive mental attitude in order to run the 100 metres in 10 seconds flat. Indeed, on the front page of today's Daily Mail, it reaches a new high, for want of a better word, when they respond to a report showing that people in their early 20s are more likely to be out of work because of ill health than those in their early 40s. They respond by saying, Generation Sick Note. Young people are increasingly blaming mental health problems for being jobless. So young people are blaming mental health problems, writes the so-called health editor. They're blaming, it's not, young people are increasingly suffering from mental health problems to such a degree that they struggle to find a place in the workforce. That might be somebody worthy of the title health editor, but not on Paul Dacre's Daily Mail. No, they're blaming mental health problems. Young people are blaming broken legs for their inability to run the 100 metres in 10 seconds flat. Generation Sick Note. In my day, you could run the 100 metres with 2 broken legs. I don't know what's wrong with the younger generation, snowflakes. And I told you it was going to happen. You can't pretend I didn't. You might agree with the weirdos writing this bilge or spouting it, but you can't argue with me when I say I told you this was going to happen next. The programs of austerity and universal credit and the demonization of the unemployed have created a welfare state that is now less comforting and less generous than it's been at any other point in living memory. But for these ghouls, it's still too generous. It's still too susceptible to fraud. It's amazing how two newspapers tell the story differently. The Times is declining fast towards Daily Mail level depths of disgustingness, but thank goodness their social effect. Well, he doesn't write the headline, of course. But the Daily Mail goes for Generation Sick Note. Young people are increasingly blaming mental health problems for being jobless, which is not what the report actually says. The Resolution Foundation report says that mental health problems are the reason why growing numbers of young people are struggling to find places in the workforce. But the Times reports exactly the same report from exactly the same foundation in a completely different way. People in their early 20s are more likely to be out of work because of ill health than those in their early 40s, according to a report laying bare Britain's mental health crisis. Now, I don't know whether you are as interested as I am in the psychology of propaganda. I am enduringly fascinated by the question of why this works. You know, it's very similar to the last hour. When Suella Braverman says that everybody on a peace march is an Islamist hate marcher, why does it work? Who does it reach? Who laps it up? And similarly, when the Daily Mail says that all young people, or certainly implies that all young people with mental health problems are liars and are on the lam and are work-shy losers, who does that appeal to? I suppose it's people who don't like thinking, is it? I don't know. But I do know this. It's horribly unfair. As with any desperate attempt to portray everybody in any constituency as a liar, you have to acknowledge that there may be some, in fact I'm sure there are, some people who have exaggerated or embellished their difficulties in order to get a doctor's note so that they can live on the relative pittance that you receive in return for having a doctor's note. Statutory sick pay in this country, as we discovered during lockdown, is an absolute joke compared to many, many comparable economies. So we may allow ourselves a side order of psychology a little later this hour. Who does it appeal to? Speaking of lockdown, we discovered a wonderful new tool, didn't we, during lockdown on these topics, which is to get you to tell me about someone you know who falls for it. A bit like Dave's message earlier about his Telegraph reading friend who he took on a Palestinian peace march, and his mate couldn't believe the demographics of the marchers, or indeed the presence of a group of Orthodox Jews on the streets. Well, you wouldn't, would you, if you were relying upon the usual suspects for your coverage of what's happening, or listening to people like Suella Braverman. So the question of who this stuff appeals to fascinates me. But I want to begin with a question about who is being maligned here, who is being demonised, the people who are being called liars by the Daily Mail. 2/3 of people aged 18 to 24 report suffering from poor mental health. I need to do this confession. I do it quite regularly, don't I? I would once have been someone who said, oh, we didn't call it poor mental health in my day. We just called it being sad or being a bit anxious or having difficulties. But if you want to fix something, the best thing you can do is give it a name. You want to fix a problem, the best thing you can do is identify it. Best way to identify it is to name it. Best way to fix it is to know it. So I am fully conscious of what the mental process of, if you like, forgivable bigotry looks like. Everything was fine in my day. I got depressed at school. Nobody called me mentally ill, or nobody talked about my mental health problems. Exactly. And if they had, you'd have felt better much sooner. If you'd had therapy, for example, you'd have felt much better much sooner. But you somehow end up in this weird calcified state where you have to insist that there's nothing wrong with them over there, they're just pretending, because otherwise you'd somehow have to admit your own vulnerabilities that went untreated when you were a teenager, and partly explain why you're so angry and difficult to live with these days. Oh, a bit of a tangent there. Let me drag me back to the main road of this one. Tell me about your children. All right? So I don't think there is any need for me to apologise. You are welcome to tell me about your own mental health, but what I really want to hear is from mums and dads. You've got a young person in your life, and I think we can lower the age a bit. So teenager to 20s, teenagers and 20s. You've got a child in their teens or their 20s who have a life-affecting mental health condition, right? Whether it's depression, anxiety, or even bipolar disorder, you have a young person in your life who struggles with their mental health. There are ups and there are downs, but there are struggles. And I want you to tell me two things. I want you to tell me what it's like, all right? The greatest question anyone who does what I do for a living can ever ask. What was it like? What is it like? 0345 6060 973. And the second question is, how do you respond to right-wing media, because it will be right-wing media, calling your kids liars? 0345 6060 973, blaming mental health problems for being jobless. This is sensational. I've got someone's in Idiot's Corner already. May's blamed it all on Prince Harry. Even before this report, once Prince Harry legitimised mental illness, it's obvious it would be used as an excuse not to work. It's not rocket science, says May. It's certainly not rocket science, May. Down with legitimising mental illness, eh? Let's carry on. We should just carry on burning people or locking them up in asylums if they've got even the vaguest problem with their mental health, May. Anyway, that's not an asylum for you. They don't really exist anymore. It's straight into Idiot's Corner before your feet can touch the ground. So that's all. I want the children. I want the parents' story about children. Because if you are like May, then, 500 19-year-olds ringing up to describe why they struggle to get to college, or why they couldn't go to school for half of their sixth form, or why they suffer from depression or suffer from anxiety. She just wouldn't believe any of them. She'd think it was all Prince Harry's fault. Probably thinks he's walking around with a little remote control in his pocket, controlling generations of young people who are struggling with their mental health for a whole heap of reasons, many of which we didn't have to deal with when we were young. For example, bloody climate change. The thought that our species might not survive. There's just one tiny example of what might be happening here. But that's how we're going to do it. Number one, what's it like to watch the people on this planet you would die to protect? Single, simplest definition of parenting. If you're lucky enough to have good parents, they would die for you. So the experience of watching the people on this planet you would die to protect struggle in ways that you cannot reach. What's that like? 0345 6060 973. And we don't have to go into the deepest depths, all right? It can just be they're okay now, but for half of year 11, they couldn't leave the house. Whatever it is, in many ways, the more diverse the experience is, the more effective this hour of radio will be. Because the second question will be, what would you say to the health editor of the Daily Mail when she says they're just blaming mental health for their inability to join the workforce or live a more, quotes, normal, end quotes, life? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 11:18. 21 minutes after 11. There are long and, I suspect, very complicated conversations to have about why the younger generation suffers with, or indeed acknowledges much more, problems with mental health. But to claim that they're just blaming it to avoid going to work is, I mean, it's almost too stupid to credit until I reveal what newspaper it's in. So the reality of these sort of experiences, please. 22 minutes after 11. Let's start in St. Ives. Russell's there. Russell, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello,
first time caller, long time listener.
Welcome.
It was when you said, I just think they were feeling a bit sad.
Yeah.
And I mean, my sort of understanding of depression was zero, and my sympathy towards it was pretty much zero as well, until my own daughter suffered from it and still does. She's 18 now, but she was under CAMS for several years as a child, and and entertained suicidal thoughts, and and had to have a lot of therapy, and is still going through therapy now, which we're paying for now because she's 18 and out of CAMS' care. CAMS being desperately underfunded anyway.
And impossible, really, to get access to unless things have already reached a fairly dire state of affairs, as your family clearly did.
Yeah. I mean, it actually had to reach that state of affairs for any involvement from them, and that's not their fault. They're hopelessly underfunded. But I would not have changed my opinion on this had I not had direct experience of it.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? So in many ways, who does it appeal to? The readers of the newspaper that says young people are just blaming mental health for being out of work. The answer's fairly straightforward, isn't it? It is people with a propensity to believe things that paint others in a bad light with no personal experience of the issue themselves.
Yeah, they're preaching to the choir. Journalists with an agenda, spinning it around.
Why are we like that, then?
Want to believe that anyway.
Why are we like that? Where did that come from? Why would we not be a little bit more amenable to empathy?
I think we're born with whatever views we have, and it's very difficult to change those views unless you have direct experience. Well, maybe not. Maybe we're just split down the middle, James. 48-52.
The infernal ratio. We're clearly not born with the views that we have. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I do.
Okay, but we must have a propensity to have a certain viewpoint. I don't know what governs that or what influences that, but it does seem to be fairly evenly split.
Other people are taking the mick, and I am definitely not. It's a very popular position, isn't it? Everyone else is taking the mickey, but I'm not. Maybe it's people who wish they could take the mickey more, who want to accuse everybody else of doing it. I don't know.
Well, it's like none of us are bad drivers, James.
No, I am actually.
Just everyone else. So am I.
I respect your honesty. I'm glad that your daughter is getting better, but I fully appreciate how hard it can be, and how lucky you are to be in a position, for want of a better word, to be in a position to pick up where the state stops at that. Turning 18 is a terrible milestone in these kind of conditions. But there it is. Now that's a perfect first caller in a way. Yeah, if it hadn't happened to my daughter, who I know is not lying, who I know is not swinging the lead, who I know doesn't need to be more robust or develop positive mental attitudes. It's a PE teacher's approach, really, to life. I had a PE teacher 40 years ago who used to say, it's only pain, it doesn't really hurt. And you'd think, no, it really does. That was at the same school where one lad went to see matron with a broken collarbone and she gave him a fisherman's friend. Alex is in Liverpool. Alex, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I'm 20. I'm a student, and actually I sort of wanted to... I mean, I didn't want to focus on it a lot, but I do have issues myself relating to mental health. Sure. In fact, I'm sort of a bit panicky right now. I've got some quite severe anxiety, and I'm on medication. And to be honest, I sort of just wanted to comment on just sort of what the rhetoric is from sort of both the government, but then also just the press. And like, I think it's just so offensive what they say about mental health. And also just sort of, I think that it just sort of shows a short-sightedness of them to think that somehow that all these people are lying about their mental health issues. I mean, to be honest, I think it's hardly surprising that people my age are struggling with mental health because, I mean, I can just about remember Gordon Brown, the first Prime Minister I can remember, but really David Cameron's the first Prime Minister I can remember, and ever since then it's just been absolute mess, hasn't it? And, I've pretty much only known things going downhill. So how could you not be feeling depressed in this sort of...
You mean a sort of existential threat? I mean, it is about what the future will hold, not just in terms of climate, but in terms of economy, the breach of the social contract, that you used to give your time in return for capital. You'd have enough to have a home for your generation. Sorry, I don't want to add to your burdens, Alex. I'm just sort of running through some of the things that differentiate your generation from mine. Help me with something else, though, if you could. When I was your age, it was not really spoken about at all. I was at a boarding school, and every year or two, someone would just quietly disappear. Someone who had sort of, got very poorly. And sometimes we would see some of the decline, sometimes we wouldn't. It would depend what boarding house you were in, and then no one would talk about it. So what about the idea that because the stigma has been largely removed, the conversation is now a lot more commonplace, that two things can then happen, either... Or two things can happen at the same time. Lots more people come forward and are diagnosed and treated. Yeah. But at the same time, if you're watching it from the outside, you might think, well, it's a much, forgive me for clumsy language, it's a much better time to have mental health problems than it was 30 years ago. How come so many people are suffering so much more? Do you see what I mean?
Well, I think that actually, the whole stiff upper lip kind of thing, I think that what that does is that it can actually improve mental health in the short term, and people do sort of just get on with their lives, because lots of the mental health advice which I've been given by counsellors and so on throughout my time, because this has been quite a long-term thing, is sort of, do something, obviously take medication if there's medication, do meditation, whatever, but, get on with things, because you feel worse if you lie down and you just stay all day in bed. So stiff upper lip, I think, in the short term does actually work. But what it does cause is I think, it can cause serious mental health problems in later life. I mean, older men who get depression when they're 50, who can't cope, So just because there's loads of people coming forward now, yes, it may seem awful and stuff like that, but those people would be hidden in the system, and then later in life something awful happens to them.
Well, we know that suicide rates for the demographics you describe are, I think, higher than under 40s actually, are higher than any other, or historically. So coming forward and talking about things can only help, however bad those things may be. Which leads us to the idea that you are somehow faking it, or you're not trying hard enough to get better. Alex, how do you deal with that? Not just from the media, but you must encounter that in life a bit as well.
Well, to be honest, lots of the people who do say those things, so, sort of the press I see, the people who do say that kind of thing, I mean, I don't like those their views on other things, so I just don't really listen to them, because I'm quite a left-wing person. I don't really care what the Daily Mail has to say about people like me, because they say disgusting things about people all the time. So, I mean, it doesn't bother me too much. And then people around me, I'm very lucky to say that most of my friends are, all my friends are very supportive, and there's very few people who aren't kind to me about it. And I think that it's actually quite a positive about people my age, because, I've got friends around me, men who are quite masculine, like stereotypically quite masculine people, but they're still completely kind about these kind of things, and they're able to talk about it, and that's the kind of thing which we should strive for.
Yeah, your generation has got that right. Certainly, from my knowledge of it, the way that you treat each other and the way that you talk to each other. I'm generalising hugely, but you have to when you're talking about generational change and generational difference. Well done, mate. That was a really helpful contribution, and I'm very grateful to you. And I hope your recovery continues. I hope things get better for you. And the question of why anybody would want to portray Alex, when he finishes his studies and tries to go to work, seeks work and struggles to fit neatly into the workforce because of his mental health problems. The idea that anyone would accuse him then of blaming mental health for being jobless, it's just extraordinary, really. How you blame the employers for not being more accommodating of the panoply, the multiplicity of mental health conditions. It's 11:31. Holly Harris has your headlines. 25 minutes after 12 is the time. I hate this because it happens, doesn't it, sometimes? If I get the question right, and I think perhaps asking mums and dads to ring in, Alex's contribution notwithstanding, I'll just read you this actually, Alex, from Jen, who's in Sunderland. He says, what a great contribution from Alex. I have a much younger son, much younger than Alex, with debilitating OCD that started during lockdown. I hope he comes to understand himself as well as Alex clearly does. But you get the question right and you get a much better indicator of how big an issue is than if you don't get the question right. And I'm afraid this one's huge. So I'll shut up and take as many calls as I can. Rennie's in Feltham. Rennie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Hello. First of all, thank you so much for what you bring to the world in terms of your radio.
Well, they do pay me. They do pay me, Rennie. They do. But thank you. What a lovely thing to say.
You're a voice of reason, and you do challenge some just ridiculous notions in our right-wing press and in the government. So I applaud you.
Thank you.
But in terms of the subject that you're discussing right now, I have a lot of experience. I have a 24-year-old son who has been through hell. To be honest, I'm grateful he's alive. Yes. And a lot of that was just down to the fact that I kind of gave up my life to look after him. And the struggle I've had to get help is shocking. If you are not somebody who is bold and you're persistent and you are willing to shout loud, you're just not going to get anywhere with our system. And I've had to jump up and down for my son, and I will always do that because I am his mother, but I know not everyone can do this. And my son is now 24. He's been sectioned. He was in a specialist unit. He has severe OCD.
Yeah.
But to even get a diagnosis
to get seen, unless he's made an attempt on his own life, even to get a referral to CAMHS in many health authorities is almost impossible, or very, very difficult.
Yeah. Well, the difference between CAMHS and adult care is shocking.
Yeah.
I have to say, in Hounslow, CAMHS is actually was amazing. I mean, the support they gave my son, his mental health really dived in secondary school.
Right.
And CAMHS were amazing. They really stepped in and gave him a lot of support.
Good.
But once he turned 18,
they cut loose.
It was, oh my goodness, it was just shocking. And I've had to fight so hard for him, and honestly, it's exhausting.
Well, and that's where your life is put on hold, which is where this suggestion that he is blaming his mental health problems for being jobless, I mean, what you describe and what the massive majority of people who know what you're talking about to varying degrees or who are contacting the programme today, that I think that must be the hardest thing to communicate, is how utterly obscene it is to suggest that anybody would choose to be in this position.
Absolutely. My son has ambition. He wants to work. He wants to one day get married, have children, own a home. He has these dreams. But he is, he does have a very severe mental health problem. He was also recently diagnosed as being on the spectrum. Again, I had to fight for him to get a diagnosis. And do you know they have their one psychologist in Hounslow who does assessments?
Yes.
And you have to wait years to even have your first conversation.
Which must be a nightmare for them. That's another point that we miss sometimes, is that imagine wanting to dedicate your life to helping people like your son and feeling every day that you're barely touching the sides. And these are the political issues. So the front pages should be about the government, about the underfunding, about the failure to address, from schools right through to CAMHS and adult care, but it's not. They're trying to blame the patients. They're trying to blame the patients. Generation sick note. That's your son. Generation sick note.
No, my son wants to work.
Of course
right now
he does.
He can't. He still has a lot of growing up to do.
Don't we all?
He's called well, he's called high functioning. Okay. You know, he's high functioning, and I think that's why it was missed at school as well.
A lot of masking, which makes the mental health situation worse.
But you know, the masking gets more difficult as they get older.
Does it?
And he just at secondary school, he just couldn't keep. Well, yeah, and again, the provision in schools, which is another matter in terms of mental health support. Again, I had to fight and go into school. My son was always sick. He was always, leaving lessons and getting worried and upset and distressed and wanting to come home. It's just not normal behaviour. And you would think the schools would have picked up on it, and his teachers would have picked up on it. But again, he was overlooked because he wasn't disruptive, he wasn't naughty, he's polite, he's respectful.
Well, that's the masking, isn't it? That's the trying to fit in, but the mental toll it takes upon him is destructive. And not to defend teachers, because I don't know the detail, but there will be an element of the CAMHS problem there as well, in that classroom assistants are the first to let go when schools are having their budgets cut or their energy bills mean that they've got to get rid of teachers, and the idea that schools would like to do a lot more, I think, is probably a given, probably certain, and of course they can't. And on it goes. A generation sick note is the response of the newspaper. And the reason I obsess a little bit about the Daily Mail is because an awful lot of people who do what I do for a living take their lead from the Daily Mail as well. It's not confined, whether they're on the telly or the radio or writing columns, it's not confined to that one organ, that one rancid organ. It's about discourse. It's about public discourse. So you'll hear a caller ring the station and say, well, there's no such thing, they just need to toughen up. And that idea has been, if not seeded, then certainly watered by this sort of quotes journalism, end quotes. That's why we do it. I think you understand that, but just in case you don't, I know Rennie does. This is weird. You're going to think I'm making up their names, but I've had another text off another Karen. It's not the same Karen as before. But this Karen says, unless you're sectioned or hospitalised for mental health, you've not experienced the reality of the conditions that are in need of help. Life has challenges for us all. Coping mechanisms should be encouraged. I don't want to be rude, Karen, but I see some stupid texts in my studio, and then I see texts like yours. So what do you think happens at all the points prior to the hospitalisation or the sectioning? Because until that happens, you've just said, these conditions aren't real. You should be doing coping mechanisms. So what do you think happens at all those previous points where you're not actually hospitalised yet or you're not actually sectioned yet? You don't think it is the same condition that is escalating? It's the same condition that is developing. I almost feel we need to create something that goes a bit further than Idiot's Corner for you today. That is one of the most unpleasant and ill-informed things I've read in a long time. And I host phone-ins with Sadiq Khan on a monthly basis, so I see some right old Belgian bile, right up there with what the former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party was saying only on Friday. Mary's in Belfast. Mary, what would you like to say?
Hi, Jim.
Hello, Mary.
Hi, a little bit nervous.
It's only me. It's only me.
Well, James, I just wanted to say, when you asked that question about what's it like as a parent, I'm off work today. I'm pottering around the house, tidying up, and that question really just made me stop in my tracks because I have two daughters who have had mental health issues. One was diagnosed. Lockdown had a big kind of factor.
Yes.
And my eldest daughter suffers from anxiety and self-harm. But the one thing I remember when my youngest daughter, it's just pure terror because she was intense. She wasn't eating. She was compulsively exercising. She couldn't cope with school. And we were very fortunate in that CAMHS were a massive support for us. But I just remember some days I just felt like I was holding on to her by the tip of her shirt.
Yeah,
and
I understand.
She was so unwell. And the thing about it is as well that it's really hard, the lack of understanding with people with mental health, because if she had have had, God forbid, leukemia, or she had have had the symptoms, she wouldn't have been held responsible for her symptoms if it was pain or, nausea. But because it manifested itself in behaviours, people were just saying, well, just get her to eat, just get her to sit down. I mean, there was a period for about 9 months she didn't sit on her backside. She would have, it's called micro-exercising. She would have sat on the tips of her toes because that burned calories. She was walking around the house compulsively, this OCD behaviour. Yeah. And I just remember as a parent, CAMHS were amazing. CAMHS were a lifeline. But I just remember as a parent having to be like a therapist and just change completely the way that you parent, because as a parent, you want to protect your child from everything. But the thing that she was most terrified of, and it was terror, was eating. And I couldn't protect her from that. I had to force her to do...
You have to relearn, I suppose, your own vocabulary of encouragement. You can't, because the temptation, whether from frustration or from a place of love or somewhere in between the two, is to believe that it's possible to cajole somebody into doing something. Because you can, can't you? If you can't get them out of bed on a Sunday morning, the tactics you deploy to get them out of bed, the lazy little so-and-sos, are going to make the situation with your daughter that you described much, much worse, not better. Worse, because she's going to lose your support, your trust.
And the thing is, well, you have to switch that part of your brain off, that love it, correct, that really kind of parent, and actually just become a little bit numb in yourself. To say, you know what, you are doing this, and I hate you, you know why you do it. And because the illness, I mean, they describe anorexia, they usually give it a name, and it was like living with this thing in our house that we had to tolerate and fight against. And I remember my husband just breaking down one day and said, like, our child has a mental illness, and it just hit him like a wrecking ball, because it was and there's a certain amount of and I don't know how to say it, there's a certain amount of shame that's attached to it as well. The stigma of what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? Because I would have thought that our children were happy. They had what they needed. It was a safe, it's a loving home. And actually to have that come into your house, just like a hand grenade. And a lot of the therapy and stuff that is done with these children who are suffering to get out of bed and go to school and are intent on destroying themselves, it's done by parents, and it's done behind closed doors with people who don't. I didn't really know as a mother how to parent myself, but I had to relearn. And thankfully,
you describe it really well. I think that'll be helpful for people who are in the foothills of the mountains that you've climbed. That idea of having to unlearn or ignore some of your parenting impulses and ask yourself instead, how do I help? How do I actually help? And sometimes helping is not saying you've got to do, well, obviously it's not saying you've got to do this, you've got to eat that, you've got to get up, you've got to go there. How do I actually help? How do I help get her through today? Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes with anorexia, it's like 3 meals a day and 3 snacks. So everything just went from snack to meals, and the in-between, and the anxiety and the deception. And then, so it's relentless, and it's exhausting. But the one thing I promised myself, because my daughter's now doing very, very well, the both of them are, thankfully. Good. But one thing I just to give a message out there to parents is that there is hope, and you can get through it, and to take all the resources that you can, but sometimes it really is just the trenches. You are in the trenches. And the phrase that I've heard a lot is to sit with it. Sometimes you just have to sit with the pain. You have to acknowledge that your child has to just sit with their pain, whereas the impulse of a parent is, I must fix this. Mums or dads, maybe even more so with dads who've got that daft hunter-gatherer legacy. I must fix this. I must make things better. Sometimes you've just got to sit with it. And then, as Mary reminds us, things will or can get better. Thank you. I'm very late for the break. It's the only reason I'm moving on. But because you've been talking about eating disorders, and one of my favourite listeners, Jennifer in Stilton, has had a terrible time in that area, and she recommends an article in The Guardian by John Harris that explains your illness worsens, so your care is cut off. This is the scandal playing out in eating disorder treatment. It's a topic that we must turn to more specifically at some point in the very near future. The time now is 11:49. It is 11:53, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We've avoided the side order of psychology today because the central question of what's it actually like to be living this has proved so, I don't want to say popular or powerful, but here we are. I don't get it. I think the first caller came close. Was it Bob in Brighton who just said, I would have once been very much of the view that you just need to pull your socks up, and then my daughter got depression, clinical depression, and you realise that all of this talk of robustness or resilience, or young people blaming mental health for joblessness is beyond obnoxious. It's beyond obnoxious. And it's not dissimilar, although it doesn't feel that way, to the last hour, where you find, because there are some people who go on these pro-Palestine marches who are clearly possessed of pretty vile views. But the idea that you use them to malign everybody is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But there it is. So 30p Lee has explained his refusal to apologise without actually accounting for the words that he used. He said that Sadiq Khan had given London to his mates, when by mates he meant Islamists and extremists, which is clearly not true. But again, with this fellow, we find ourselves wondering whether he is just too thick to understand the meaning of the words that he uses, or whether something a little more sinister is going on. But he's talking about the abject failures of the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, on the question of policing these marches, and says hundreds of people have been arrested. Luckily, they do actually keep count of arrests, and although it's hard to get numbers that are smack up to date, as recently as the 7th of February, when Operation Brock reported on what sort of arrests had actually been happening, the numbers were fairly easy to find. He says, failing to find them. I'll share them with you shortly. So that's how you do it. That's how you keep the idea alive. Operation Brox, which the Met calls its response to the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza and its impact on London. So up until the end of December, there were only 153 arrests, with 117 people being released without charge. Now, you can, of course, argue that that's too many, but then you'd have to ban Glastonbury as well, because the percentage per attendee is lower on the Palestinian peace marches than it is at Glastonbury. That's a nice bit of number crunching put together by Open Democracy, which is a rather splendid journalism organisation. So he's lying now, even when he's apologising. Or no, sorry, even when he's not apologising, he's lying. It's not a sort of evidence of hundreds of people being arrested. Certainly until the end of last year, the majority of the marches took place, hadn't even reached 200, of which a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion were actually charged. But hey-ho, back to the question of mental health and children and the narrative that they are all liars or somehow blaming mental health problems for being jobless, as opposed to being jobless because of mental health problems. Words are important, aren't they? Rachel's in Chesham. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a situation where my daughter is still at a very young age. I mean, she's had, I would have picked out her mental health problems when she was around 7.
Right.
She's now 14. It's taken me up until maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years, to get her under CAMS, because in spite of me, being under social services on and off, asking them for help, asking for family resilience for help, asking CAMS for help, but because she wasn't at that age, they refused to see her or assess her. It wasn't until she got to secondary school and things have actually spiralled more now. She's at this point of self-harming. Trying to get her to go to school is a task in itself. When she's there, she doesn't engage. And I keep, with social services and all the other organisations, is that if they had maybe put a little bit of effort in before, maybe we wouldn't be where we're at.
That's true of almost all health issues, isn't it? Prevention rather than cure, but they're just not built that way. And when she's older, God forbid she's not better, and she won't be able to go to work, then the narrative that these people are trying to put out there is that she would somehow be blaming mental health problems for being jobless, rather than us asking how can we help people with mental health problems find their way into school or find their way into a work. But it's her fault under this reading. It's her fault, and that's just gross.
Well, because she wasn't, I mean, CAMS, they've tried with sort of different therapies, but they don't seem to work. They've tried with medication, but she refuses to take it.
Right.
You can't force them.
No.
And it's my main concern is about her future, and I am petrified of what her future holds, because she just,
well, of course
she's
you are.
At this age, how is she going to be as she gets older?
Yeah. And that is every parent's nightmare, isn't it? That is the very definition of parenting, is a deep concern about your child's future. A few people have been in touch about a condition called PANS pandas, Rachel. I don't know if you know about it or if you've looked into it, but it's an immunosuppressant condition that often manifests itself as mental health problems, but in fact it's caused by inflammation. It's relatively nascent. The Americans are way ahead of us on this, but it is now happening and being more widely recognised in this country, including by the NHS. And I'm certainly not giving you any medical advice. I'm just making you aware of something that lots and lots of people aren't aware of, and which children who display mental health problems are sometimes found to have. So it's worth looking at. It's 3 minutes after 12, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm just going to put you in Idiot's Corner, but only in the hope that you will be able to realise why you're there. So talking about Anderson 30p Lee claiming that hundreds of people are arrested at the Palestinian marches, so creating the idea that there's been a failure by Sadiq Khan to clamp down on it properly by pointing out how many people, hundreds of people, have been arrested. You can see the logical fragility of that position. But, of course, the figures don't support him. The number of arrests doesn't even reach 200, which means this is up until the end of last year, which means technically, of course, you can't even use hundreds in any meaningful sense. But of the 153 arrests, 117 have been released without charge. So Idiot's Corner gets in touch to say, because they haven't been arresting them, have they? You absolute, and then a rude word. So it wasn't me that pointed out the arrests. It was 30p Lee, your mate. You see, he said there had been hundreds of arrests, and you're getting in touch to support him by saying that there haven't been any arrests. I'm going to go out on a limb and say even you can understand how stupid that is. So 30p Lee says you can tell how bad things are because there have been hundreds of arrests, and then you text the radio station, cleverly without putting your name on it, to say, well, that's because they're not arresting people. So the reason why there's been hundreds of arrests is because they're not arresting people. And you wonder why Idiot's Corner gets so crowded some days. Speaking of Idiot's Corner, I'm going to give a prominent politician who comes in for a fairly routine kicking on this programme, I'm going to give him a day pass. Jacob Rees-Mogg has done something today that genuinely caused me to do a double take. You may not even agree with him. As it is, I think I do, although it's a conversation that we had on the programme last week. I find myself in the, I think, unprecedented and unique position of seeing Jacob Rees-Mogg sound very like I did last week. So we're going to give him a day pass, a day release, we could call it. We're putting Jacob Rees-Mogg on day release from Idiot's Corner because he has, in the spirit of stopped clocks, said something both intelligent and insightful. I know, don't look at me like that, all right? That's a very true point. It is only 12:05. So it may be a little previous to give him a day release. We'll get, okay, morning release. Whether he realised it or not, he was not in Idiot's Corner this morning. Sadly, it's now 6 minutes after 12, so he's out. He would be, but anyway, I'll share that with you a little later in the programme. It's an extraordinary intervention, shall we say. It is 6 minutes after 12. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This drink spiking story from the Sunday Times yesterday is extraordinary. And I don't generally say the phrase as a dad of, or even the next version of that, which is as a dad of daughters. But my goodness me, I always thought we were short on evidence for this. We've talked about it off air. I can't remember whether we've ever talked about it on air. But I always thought that the likelihood of it being as endemic as some people claimed was quite low. And yet this Sunday Times story yesterday has absolutely blown the doors off. And I mean, they are convinced that the police are only receiving the tip of the iceberg. And part of the reason why they've arrived at this conclusion is because MPs are deluged with reports from victims. And the incidences of drink spiking now are everywhere. House parties, work events, festivals. They're not new, by the way. I read a lot of historical fiction. They were around. It's where the phrase Mickey Finn comes from, or knockout drops. And they explained this in the Sunday Times yesterday, but I suppose like everything else, it just comes back round again. 74% of the victims are women, according to Home Office data, and the average age is about 26, although many people quite close to the issue suggest that the real numbers are probably considerably higher than we know. I do think it is happening more. It is an incredibly predatory crime, says one expert. Anecdotally, it often belongs to a pattern of behaviour, making these people very dangerous, often to women. One of Brianna Jai's murderers was, of course, excluded from school for spiking another pupil before she went on to murder Brianna. And some of the case studies picked up by the Sunday Times yesterday were absolutely chilling. So, again, it's all about getting the question right, isn't it? Obviously, we are going to look at the reality of what it's actually like. That's a scary question to ask, even more much scarier to answer. And I think if we were to acknowledge the existence of skeptics, Ferrari told a story this morning that I think answered my question quite well. To acknowledge the existence of skeptics would involve the question of where you derive your certainty from that your drink was spiked. Because it has been tempting in the past for people to suggest that you must have just drunk a little bit more than you were used to, or you must have found yourself in unfamiliar levels of intoxication. But Nick Ferrari on his breakfast show told a story about him believing he'd been spiked because as someone with a very long and enthusiastic history of alcohol consumption, he knew that something very, very, very different had happened to him. It's worth listening back to. It was characteristically, he told the story in a very amusing fashion, but not in any way detracting from the seriousness of what he described. And that intrigues me, that question of how you know for sure that something very, very different has happened. One of the Sunday Times case studies talks about only taking a tiny sip of a drink before a friend called across the table that they'd seen someone put something in it and the whole round was thrown away. But 20 minutes later, she was beginning to feel very different from how she'd ever felt before. And she managed to get home, not sure, no memory of the journey home, and then woke up the next morning on the bathroom floor. So this notion of spiking, I think, needs to be removed from the "are you sure" territory and into what should we do. And I think there are two ways to do this. So the first, of course, is to ask the question of how you know and what it was like. That story that will make anybody listening, male or female, pay a lot more attention next time they're out and about to where their drink is at all times and who has had any access to it at all. All right? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 11 minutes after 12 is the time. And the second question is one I think you probably aren't going to answer, because I can't quite imagine circumstances in which I would. Because even if I could, which I can't, I wouldn't. Because, well, it will soon become clear. How about someone listening to this program right now who knows about spiking from the other side? Okay? I don't think I could bear talking to you if you were a spiker. I don't know that I've got the self-control necessary to hear your story. By all means, if you want to, test me on that. But I do think it more likely that you've got a mate who does it, or a colleague, or who has done it, and you perhaps didn't fully appreciate the gravity of it, the seriousness of it. I can almost imagine being in that situation. I'd like to think that none of my friends would ever even contemplate such behaviour. But if you look back over, I'm 52 now. I know what you're thinking. God, you look much younger. If I look back over, what would it be, from 16, 17, 18? Yeah, you're looking at almost 40 years of socialising and friendship groups changing and comings and goings and friends of friends who you didn't really like. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that you are listening to this program right now and thinking immediately of someone you know or someone you used to know. And I would love to hear your story on 0345 6060973. Already, I've heard from one of the, I think the word I would use is victims, but I'm always conscious that some people don't like that word. But I've already heard from one woman who was spiked, and a trigger warning now for anyone who's been a victim of sexual assault, spiked and raped by John Warboys, the black cab driver. And this texter tells me, I don't know if you want me to read your name out, that you got the case to court and he was jailed. I remember that extremely well. That story is, I mean, a grim story. And one of the earlier introductions to the practice of drink spiking for much of the British media and the broader British public. So this isn't a question that is born of scepticism. It's a question that is designed to diffuse scepticism. I hope the difference is clear. What happened to you, and how did you know for sure that you'd been spiked? I'm interested also in aftercare. I'm interested in what happens when you do go to the authorities. Most people won't. Most people don't. But that's what I'd like to hear. 0345 6060973. And then, in full expectation of not getting any calls, this isn't one of those slightly provocative mornings or afternoons where I say, I bet I don't get any calls. And then obviously I'm secretly expecting the phones to ring off the hook, and they usually do. But I don't know quite how we would do this. I don't think I could tolerate talking to a drink spiker, because you are a predator of the very worst kind, either actually or potentially. But if you know a mate has done it, or an acquaintance or a colleague, I want you to talk me through your processes, your thought processes, all right? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's coming up to 12:15. You're listening to James O'Brien. The figures are very, very hard to identify, but a government minister has warned that reports to police are just the tip of the iceberg. The National Police Chiefs Council says that police are falling short when it comes to testing. Labour says it will introduce new standalone laws to tackle the crisis. You have to presume it crossed Keir Starmer's desk a few times when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. And police forces next month will start training in the specific area of spiking. I wonder what you think that training should look like. And I wonder what you've been through that makes you recognise how urgent the need for it is. It's 12:15. 12:18 is the time. It is LBC. I didn't listen to Classic FM yesterday. Joanna Gosling does a lovely show on Sunday afternoons, and she shared a story that's absolutely extraordinary. What do you think? If you are a classical pianist, if you're a sort of world-class pianist, and you turn up for work, you've got a big concert on, and the orchestra starts to play, all right? You're sitting at your piano stool. The orchestra starts to play. The conductor starts waving his arms around. I know it's more complicated than that. What's the single worst thing? No illness involved. No external influences. Nothing bad happened as a concert. Nothing bad happened particularly. But what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the worst thing that could enter your head at that point? So you've got a concert. Audience is there. Conductor starts waving his baton around. orchestra strikes up, the opening notes, the overture, if that's the correct terminology. You're the star attraction. You're the classical pianist. You're the what's the word I want? The virtuoso. You're the virtuoso. And as soon as the music starts, you realise something. What's the worst thing it could be? I'm tempted to take calls on this, but I won't because phone lines are free for a start. But full rather. But I'll tell you shortly. It's absolutely extraordinary, and I'm still not quite sure what happened, because, well, I won't give away any further clues, but I shall give you the answer to that before I go home today, hopefully. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. This issue of spiking, again, not unlike the last hour. If you were to anecdotally extrapolate from the number of people that have just rung me what the broader picture might look like, you'd be very, 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 very concerned. Jane's in Surbiton. Jane, what can you tell us?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
That was quick.
It wasn't really, maybe by my standards, but it was. Go on, carry on.
Sorry, I've never rang up before, so I didn't know what to expect.
You're very welcome.
So, thanks for taking my call.
Thank you for coming.
I just felt compelled to call because this has actually happened to me twice. And I was telling your researcher that on both occasions they were house parties. After one drink, and the second house party, I'm 52 now, I was about 34 at the time. We had new next door neighbours, so they invited myself and my husband in for a drink, and the only other people at this house party was the son of the neighbour on the other side of them, if that makes sense. And there was 3 guests at this party.
That's not really a party. Not to be pedantic, Jane.
An introduction to the street.
Yes.
And so we went in. We had one drink in the kitchen. We stood in the kitchen, and I started to feel not right. That's the only way I can put it. Queasy, just very, very, very peculiar. I'm stood in the hallway thinking I just need to go. Yeah. And the neighbour of the other side said to my husband, just lie her down on the bed upstairs. She's obviously had too much to drink. Right. I hadn't. My husband knew I hadn't. So he said, no, I'm going to take her home. Yeah. So from the journey from our next door neighbour's front garden, which was a pathway to the end of their garden, and then a pathway from our garden to the front door. Yeah. This next door neighbour but one had his hand up my skirt the entire time, and I was basically draped over my husband and him because I couldn't move. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk.
And even as your husband was there, he was assaulting you.
Yeah. My husband was oblivious.
And you were aware of it, but incapable of doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Oh my days!
I was rendered completely incapacitated.
So there's not a lot of mystery about who spiked your drink then, and who was hoping that you'd be left alone and unaccompanied in the room. Oh my days!
But I will never, 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 never forget it, because I knew exactly what was going on, and I was just powerless. There was nothing that I could do. I couldn't nudge his hand away.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I mean, it's not, obviously, when I hear these horrific cases of terrible things that happen, and it really annoys me when I hear, that you must have been drunk, or not for me, because I went next door and I had one drink.
You knew straight away something was up. What did you do? Did you pursue it at all? Do you mind me asking?
Well,
you don't have to.
No, this is the thing. I mean, literally, when I came in, I kind of, because I couldn't move, I collapsed on the stairs. My husband dragged me up to bed, and when I told him the next day, I kind of I wanted to report it, but he was fearful of repercussions. He didn't know, what kind of man this was, and what we had to live next door but one to him. But we moved. I wasn't happy living there, so we moved. But it did always stay with me, and I felt guilty because I thought, if he's done that to me, and I feel like I've escaped quite lightly, really. But obviously, had my husband not dragged me home, he and had it been a bigger party, had my husband maybe enjoyed, had he been a different person, I'd have just been put upstairs in a bedroom and unable to, do
terrifying.
anything. So, and as I was saying to your researcher, when I was 24, it happened to me for the first time. And on that occasion, I was on the boat party, was with my husband again, but at that point he was my boyfriend. And when I was at home the next day, I received lots of phone calls from my friends saying, oh my God, what happened? What happened? Are you okay? Were you drinking before you arrived?
Oh, Lord.
And exactly the same thing. I had one drink. I arrived at the party, and I have no recollection whatsoever what happened after that one drink, other than what my friends and my husband basically said, which was, again, he had to take me to a bed to lie me down because I couldn't move, and he sat with me. My friends were with me,
right,
until they were able to bring me home, and they were saying things to me like, we had to take you to the toilet. You were
and they just thought thought that you were just absolutely off your face on booze, on alcohol. And you can see why people would think that, albeit that you knew once you came round the next day that you'd only had one drink, so you just conked out, really. You blacked out, but was still, in a sense, conscious.
Yeah.
Oh, how terrible. How terrible. Yeah, a lot of people are going to wonder, and it's not my place to inquire, but you know that a lot of people are going to wonder about your husband discouraging you from going to the authorities, often pursuing that point.
We're divorced now.
I was going to ask that, but I didn't want to pry, Jane. I did actually think, are you still together, really?
I mean, he kind of tried to justify his sort of response in that it was out of concern for me. We didn't know who we're dealing with. We didn't know, how he might, what he might do. Clearly he was not very nice.
And the massive majority don't go to the authorities, so you're far from, far from alone. But there'll be people who talk themselves into not going rather than being discouraged from doing it by others. Jane, thank you. Next time you ring me, let's make sure it's a slightly happier subject, shall we?
Yeah.
If that's all right with you.
No, I love your book, by the way. Thank you. I bought it straight away.
Thank you. What a lovely thing to say. 27 minutes after 12. Take care, Jane. Oh, Lord. Becky's in Enfield. Becky, what would you like to say?
Hiya. It's weird hearing your last caller's experience because the symptoms were exactly the same. I was in a bar, a nice bar, I won't name it, in London, and it was really busy. I was there for work drinks.
Yeah.
My boss was there, and I had 2 glasses of rosé, and I got up and went to the toilet, and I knew something was wrong then. I was kind of holding myself together because obviously my boss is there, and this is a work thing,
Yeah, and you knew you weren't. You're 99% sure that this was not the consequences of drinking 2 glasses of rosé. But what else could it be? Kind of thing in your brain.
Exactly. And the cubicle was kind of spinning, and I'm doing that thing where you flop over, and you're hitting your head on the toilet roll holder, and all, like ragdoll kind of thing. Managed to get myself together enough to walk back to the table, spilt someone else's drink all over the floor in that time, sat down. Very quickly, I think it was clear that he was going to leave, so we all said our goodbyes. Yeah. Luckily, I had a good friend with me. As soon as we said goodbye, she said I just blocked out, down on the floor, and I don't remember another thing.
Good God.
She said I was being sick. This is in the streets in London, being sick. I was lying on the floor. She managed to get me up and get me in a cab. I don't remember the ride home at all. The next thing I remember was being on her bathroom floor with my head in her shower and just opening my eyes, and there were the paramedics' boots on the floor.
Right. She'd called the paramedics.
And then again I blacked out. Yeah, because she didn't know what to do with me. She knew
great friend.
that this... She was, I mean, where would I be if she wasn't there? In the gutter in London.
I wondered. I don't know about you. And the paramedics confirmed that they thought you'd been spiked, did they?
Only when they sat me up and looked in my eyes. Right. This is when they managed to get me. You're talking like a good couple of hours, few hours later. And they managed to get me sat up on her bed. They did the little torch of my eyes.
Right.
And they said to her, her pupils are really dilated. And she said before that they were just treating me as someone that had too many drinks. Fair enough. But when they saw that, my eyes were like saucers,
they knew it was drug. They knew it was drugs.
Yeah.
Did you go to the authorities? I don't suppose you were never going to catch the person responsible, were you?
Exactly. We did go back to the bar and they looked through all their CCTV, but it was so crowded, nothing came of it. They just do the obligatory, we'll look out in the future.
Yeah.
Did a crime reference number, They can't do anything at the hospitals either. They can't test you for it. You'd have to go to A&E, wait all that time in A&E, and by the time you get there, it's probably out of your system anyway. That's what they said to me. So
a lucky escape, is that not too crass a phrase, do you think? Or
100%, because if she hadn't have been there, she'd have left.
You'd have been entirely vulnerable. And it makes you wonder, Becky, how many, when you've seen people in a complete state, for want of a better phrase, and you automatically presume they've just drunk too much. But it does make you wonder about whether those people that we've all kind of encountered are...
It does, and the social stigma of it, the amount of people that went, oh, yeah, you just had too many, and I was like, no, I literally had 2 glasses of wine.
Yeah, cry. Well, I mean, thank goodness it didn't end worse. The frequency of it, though, the normalness of it. I'd have got that vain hope out for someone who knows someone who's done it, someone who knows a spiker or who used to be friends with someone, and that perhaps signalled the end of the friendship. But you're going to struggle to get through because so many people have been through what Becky's been through or worse. And an awful lot of you reminded me, Liam in York at the top of the list, that James Cleverly, of course, the current Home Secretary, joked about giving Rohypnol to his own wife, which does really make you wonder, doesn't it, about his fitness for office, although we've observed many times that the shallowness of the talent puddle from which Rishi Sunak is compelled to make major appointments is probably relevant there as well. I'm going to tell you, I'm late for the news, but I'm going to tell you this now, that there is a safety initiative called Ask for Angela that is a joint effort from the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. It's part of the Safer Business Network. And if you feel unsafe or vulnerable or threatened, anybody in that category, feeling any of those things, and you can actually approach venue staff, whether it's someone behind the bar or the pot collector or someone on the door. If you ask for Angela, that works as a code phrase to indicate to staff that you require help. Now, you may already know about that, but if there's one person listening who didn't and now does and who needs it at some point in the future, then you'll understand why I wanted to get that out before the very latest headlines with Amelia Cox. It is 12:36 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you know, a couple of you actually got it right. The question of what's the worst thing that could happen to a virtuoso pianist when she is at a concert and apart from acts of God or crimes or illness, the conductor strikes up, the orchestra strikes up, that's the phrase you use, isn't it? The orchestra strikes up, the conductor's waving his hand around, you're there, ready to play, you're the star, everyone's come to see you, and what's the worst that could happen? Mark suggests that there's no stool, there's no piano stool. That's not bad, but no, you've already sat down, I said. Laura says you've forgotten your instrument. Listen, I'm no expert, Laura, but I don't think pianists have to bring their own instrument with them to a classical concert. Maybe the oboe, well, obviously the flautists and the oboe, well, everybody else except the pianist and probably the harpist as well, or the timpani, I don't know. Altrincham Dry Cleaners, another one of my favourite Twitter accounts, suggests that they forgot to open the lid. Well, that wouldn't last very long, would it, you prune? I'm not sure people are taking this seriously, but Kit and others did actually get it right. It's an extraordinary thing. I've just tweeted it from my account at Mr. James OB. The pianist concerned, whose name I will mispronounce, for which I apologise, it's the middle name I'm not very good at. It's Maria Joao, Joao, Maria Joao Perez, has learnt the wrong piece for a concert. It's a beautiful bit of footage, and Joanna Gosling on Classic FM yesterday told the story and played the music. But that, I mean, have you ever had a bad day at work? I turned up for a book festival in Bewdley once, expecting to be interviewed on stage, and what I'd actually agreed to was to do an hour-long talk and then take questions from the audience on stage. But you know me, I do this every day, so it wasn't exactly a massive shock. I mean, if I turned up with the wrong book, which I grant you is unlikely, that would be a bit of a shock to the system. It was Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, for people who care about such things. And I think she just did it all from memory. There's no sheet music there to fall back on. I think she just did it all from memory. But what a moment. So the music starts in the background. There's a tiny moment where you go, no, that can't, what? Oh my God, I've learnt the wrong piece. And there's your answer. So just pick up on people who said I'd forget to reveal the answers to these questions. I've still got the Jacob Rees-Mogg one up my sleeve as well. I'm getting better at this. You see, Pete in Stamford suggesting I'd already forgotten about it. 12:39 is the time. Back to this horrible story, really. Stephen's in Milton Keynes. Stephen, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. You all right?
I'm good, mate. What's on your mind?
So it was really a story about my girlfriend, and it's about 2 years ago when she got spiked in London. And more from an angle of the duty of care of the bouncers, which I think was lacking at the time.
Go on.
So we were out for drinks. We had about 3 cocktails at this time, and there was a moment in the night where she dropped her ring. So we just got drinks. We put them on the bar.
Yes.
And then we were me and 2 of my mates were sort of looking around the floor with my girlfriend trying to find her ring. And I think that was a moment where obviously the drinks were free and could have been spiked.
Right.
So we found the ring. That was all fine. We went back to partying, and then she passed me her phone, said, I'm going to the toilet, completely sober, completely fine.
Yes.
Walked into the toilets, and she said it was the lights of the toilets, the bright white lights from going from the dark club into the bright white toilets where it suddenly hit her.
Right.
And she went into a cubicle and effectively sort of passed out in the cubicle with her head on the toilet. And she was gone for about 2-3 hours.
God.
I was then sort of stood outside the toilet thinking, where's she gone? Obviously, I've got her phone and I didn't know what had happened. I thought we were early in a relationship for about 6 months, so I didn't know she sort of had enough me and left me.
Yes, of course. Crosses your mind.
No, we're still together now, so it's all worked out well. But she, I couldn't find her. I was asking everyone into the toilets, can you help me find my girlfriend? I think she's in there. Last time she's seen, I'd asked the bouncers about 3 or 4 times to go in and have a look for her. And they're like, no one's in there, it's fine. Nothing's happening. And I just hadn't known what's going on. So I was sort of hanging around the club 3 hours later.
Yeah.
Until finally I was stood outside in the smoking area. And then finally a bouncer come up, carrying her out, really.
Good God.
Left her with me and said, I found her. She's had a bit too much to drink. I was like, that's bizarre. She was completely out of it. I'd never seen her in that state before. So I thought, right, let's get her home. So I left her on there's a sort of a windowsill where she could sit down. So I popped her up there. 2 of my friends were outside at the time anyway, and I sort of said to the people stood next to her, just please make sure she stays there.
Yeah.
Look after her. I'm going to go get the coats and we're going to go. Went downstairs, got the coats, got her in a taxi finally, and got her back. I've never seen anything like it.
Oh.
Then sort of trying to get her to throw up, trying to get whatever it was out of her. And admittedly at the time, I thought she had too much to drink.
So even you thought you must have missed, she must have just had a bad reaction to the booze or...
Exactly. I had no idea what was going on. And then only in the morning then she told me that while she was out at the windowsill, a man had groped her, put his hand down her chest, that no one noticed. And it made me feel like I'd failed her as well. But it was scary. And the fact that bouncers for 2-3 hours...
So she was in the locked cubicle, was she?
In a locked cubicle in the club.
And they just didn't find her?
They didn't find her, especially after sort of saying that she's somewhere, she's
She must be here. Well, they obviously thought you'd been stood up, didn't they?
Exactly. But for someone to be in the bathroom, I mean, you never know what drugs they put into someone.
No, of course you don't. What's the long-term effect on her? How's she sort of processed it?
Well, she now doesn't drink, doesn't really go out. Every time she has a drink, it brings back that taste, brings back that memory. So really? I don't blame her. It would be...
It's huge, isn't it? It's a really big deal. And when you've told that story to people, how often do people reveal that something similar has happened to them?
Quite regularly. Yeah. And it's scary because you're talking about the figures and how much is reported and the underlying figures. I think 99% of the cases are not going to be reported.
Oh, for sure, and for a whole variety of. I presume you didn't report it, did you?
We didn't. No, not at all. And I think because once you're out at the moment, once it's all gone better, or once it's better, and you realise there's no immediate danger, you're just relieved to be out of it at that point.
Yes, of course you are, and you know the likelihood. Although, as an earlier caller said, going back to look at the CCTV might help, but goodness me, you're too busy just feeling relieved and trying to recover. I get it completely. Thank you, Stephen. It's a different perspective, isn't it, from being the victim, but an important one as well, because it puts that duty of care question on bar staff and club staff. You have to hope that they're getting precisely the kind of training that they've decided now that the police forces need to get as well. 12:44 is the time. If you didn't see the article in yesterday's Sunday Times, you probably should have a look at it. Some of the recurring themes include the very small amount of alcohol that had been consumed, 1 drink, 2 drinks, for example, and yet many people will still be reaching either from unkindness or from a sort of weird sense of self-protection, reaching for the idea that it is self-inflicted, that it is just people who couldn't handle their drink or weren't used to their drink. And what I mean by a weird form of self-protection, oddly, and I do think this is a real and a present issue, it's because if you are worried that something terrible could happen to you, if you actually want to persuade yourself that the reason why it happened to somebody else was somehow something they did. Because there's nothing more terrifying than the fickleness of fate. I first worked this out, would you believe, after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, when the parents on the programme would queue up, parents of children would queue up to say that Madeleine's mum and dad had done something wrong. And you start off thinking, how can you be so callous? How can you be so cruel? It could happen to anybody. Oh. And it's the resistance to the idea that it could happen to anybody that leads some people into some quite unkind places. And I think the same would probably apply here, which is why you just have to take my word for it that the numbers are extraordinary. Number of people just getting in touch. On a much, much, much lighter note, I shall read this from Simon, a late entry to the question of what's the worst thing that could happen to a virtuoso pianist at a classical concert when the orchestra strikes up the music. And Simon has got in touch to say, did she play all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order? 10-1 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And now for the reveal, the reason why Jacob Rees-Mogg has been given a, what would you describe it as? Day release from Idiot's Corner, although morning release, because, of course, there's still plenty of the day left for him to get his season ticket back. And the article that he's written is... I mean, you can't help a little bit of jingoism towards the end and some sort of pseudo-intellectual cultural references. But his central point about Shamima Begum, who, of course, we discussed on the programme last week, is that you cannot have gradations of citizenship. You cannot. If you take away someone's citizenship, you create the reality of second-class citizenship, which I think was the phrase I used when describing this issue last week. And so you can punish people with the full force of the law, but what you can't do is exile or expel people from their own country. And because she had the right to Bangladeshi citizenship, Sajid Javid's reasoning was that he could remove her British citizenship. But as Jacob Rees-Mogg, of all people, points out, that the idea of equality of all British citizens before the law was breached by Javid's decision. He also gets himself into a bit of a mess in trying to justify the decisions of the courts to uphold Javid's decision, but credit where credit is due. He's clear about the reasons why that decision should never have been made. So I think we've got a Stopped Clock Award. We should start doing Stopped Clock Awards. And today's Stopped Clock Award, the prize for being right at least twice a day, even a stop clock manages to achieve that, goes to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Oh, no. Never do autonomous rounds of applause, Keith. Let's not get carried away, mate. Jeez, it's Jacob Rees-Mogg, mate. Even if that was an enormous deposit in the credit account, there'd still be gazillions in the debit. So I shall rescind that immediately. I shall rescind that immediately. 12:52 is the time. It is indeed the just person fallacy that I described, the idea that bad things only happen to bad people. And that is self-protection sometimes. It's important to understand things before you can help fix them. And people believing that because they don't want to believe that bad things could happen to them, they persuade themselves that the person to whom a bad thing has happened must be somehow to blame. Back to drink spiking. Alice is in Oxford. Alice, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I think I'm pretty sure that I had my drink spiked. It was about 15 years ago. And I do really relate to everything you've just said, because I even now I kind of feel a bit embarrassed to talk about it.
Oh, you shouldn't.
But I know. I know it was 15 years ago. No, it's a completely different time. And I didn't go to the police. And nothing sort of bad happened. Luckily, I was with a friend. I was at a party and I was in a room with lots of people around. But should I just describe what happened?
Okay. I mean, I just give people a heads up if there's going to be anything that might trigger them. But that seems...
No. I mean, nothing. I was at a party. I just arrived.
Yeah.
And I had one drink. I think I didn't even finish it.
Right.
And then I kind of just don't remember anything.
Good Lord.
And I woke up, kind of think hours later on a sofa in the room with lots of people, luckily. And, it was just like I'd had my mind wiped, really.
So whoever it was that did it was probably hoping, as with the very first caller, that they'd be able to get you alone in a room somewhere. And...
Well, apparently my friend, but it was a friend. That's the weird thing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, that's why I just think I just never really believed it, or
sure.
I thought there must be some other explanation, or it couldn't have been that. But I think it must have been. Apparently, they tried to invite my friend and I back to theirs.
Right.
I don't remember any of this, but and I'm sure I kind of know who it was. But I should have just gone to the police the next morning, and didn't. And I think I just felt I wouldn't. I mean, not necessarily that the police wouldn't believe me, but that friends wouldn't, and that when because people knew this person, and then you just wouldn't believe it.
That puts huge social pressure on you as well, doesn't it? But you're pretty confident you know who it was.
Yeah. Well, also there was another girl who my friend described to me later that this guy was with.
Right.
Who later on she was kind of slumped with her head in her hands. So it seems like he'd done it to two people, at least, or that we know about. And I just think I'm sure we weren't the last people he did that to. And I just feel if I'd reported it, you just hate to think of him carrying on doing that, really.
Of course you do. I mean, just to make you feel better, if it does, no one who's rung in today went to the police. That's
really?
Not one person. We've had paramedics called, but not police. So when the minister says that they think it's the tip of the iceberg, the ones that are reported to the police are the tip of the iceberg. For once, they may not have actually gone far enough.
But I think in my case, luckily, I was surrounded by people, and
But you're saying luckily. It is luckily. Those are the bits over which you have no control over anything when that happens to you. But particularly that fear, that question. I mean, the haunting one in the context of what you describe is that first caller saying, and then what the bloke that she thought had spiked her told her husband, "I'll just take her upstairs, put her on the bed, let her sleep it off." And you sort of think, well, he's got a plan there. He's got a modus operandi. Thank you, Alice. I'm sorry you were in a position to contribute. I'm sorry everyone's in a position to contribute to this conversation. If you've joined it late, I should tell you that the numbers are unknowable in the context of how big the problem actually is. The case studies in the Sunday Times yesterday were chilling, but the percentage that has surprised some of you was the percentage of victims who are women standing at, and you've inserted the word only here, the word 74%. I think there's probably a perception that it would be much higher than that, but it definitely happens to men as well. There was a famous case. There was a serial killer, wasn't there, called Stephen Port, who had spiked his victims as well. So it is by no means... And there was another terrible case in Manchester, actually, of someone whose crimes didn't even emerge until the police got hold of his phone, and he made recordings. I forget the details of that case, but it happens to men all the time as well. Thank you, Alice. Last word on this probably. Rachel in Muswell Hill. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hello. I'm a bit nervous actually talking about it, and it's so interesting to listen to the other stories because They're quite similar. I was working abroad around 12 years ago, and I'd gone out with a colleague. We became friends, but we were colleagues initially. And I had one vodka Red Bull.
Yeah.
That was it, one vodka. I'm not a heavy drinker anyway.
Sure.
And within 10 minutes, I would say, of drinking the drink, I was all over the place. I was completely out of it. She had to bring me home, which took us an hour to get back. But I was apparently saying terrible things to her, which wouldn't have been in my nature anyway.
Right.
I was vomiting. We had to get off the train because I was vomiting on the platform. I was falling in and out of consciousness on the way back. And the interesting thing, and that's the reason why I wanted to actually call in, is she was so angry with me for a few days because of how I, in her words,
you'd ruined her evening.
And how drunk I was.
Yes.
And it didn't matter how many times I told her I'd only had one drink. It's literally not possible for anything other than me to have been spiked. We actually caught up recently.
Yeah.
And she brought that night up and said, God, do you remember how drunk you were that time?
Right.
And I just felt infuriated because her refusal to want to believe the fact that I was
that you'd been spiked.
Yeah, was almost as painful as
I can understand why.
I mean, luckily, nothing worse happened, but
because she was there. So, I mean, oddly, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, that one, isn't it? If she hadn't been there, God knows what might have happened to you. But because she was there, her position is profoundly unsympathetic. Did she realise why you were so upset? Did she review her position at all?
No, which really was strange because we're looking at like 12 years ago, and 12 years later, there's so much more news about it. And but she still kind of refuses to believe me, and I was just infuriated.
I bet you were.
I just thought, why would you?
Well, that's literally adding insult to injury, isn't it? I mean, it's why would you not believe me? Why would I lie? Most people are fairly open about the times when they got themselves into ridiculous situations by drinking too much. Oddly, there's no stigma attached to that, is there? For the English, it's it's almost like a sort of rite of passage. I've shared a couple of stories on air about some of my more embarrassing moments. So there's never any shame. So why would you make it up? Why would you? Anyway, thank you, Rachel. What an arresting hour that was. And I resist the urge to make any puns about the lack of arrests. But I'll tell you what, if my switchboard is anything to go by, then the minister is quite correct. And this is a much, much, much bigger problem than the official statistics attest. If you missed any of the show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store, or just head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now, standing in for Sheila Fogarty, it is Sankita Maiska. 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 Is Sankita Maiska.